Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar on BS-EN ISO 15189 Quality Management in Laboratories. My name is Helena Barrell and I'm a Standards Development Manager at BSI, where my portfolio covers standards on healthcare and medical devices. Over the course of this webinar, we will be talking you through the main changes made to the latest revision of this standard and helping you to understand what to expect when the new edition publishes soon. Before we get going, let's just look at some housekeeping. So this is a listen-only webinar that is being recorded. We welcome your questions via the Q&A function. You may submit a question at any point throughout the webinar and we will then hold a Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. Simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel and post your question. If you experience any technical difficulties, please submit your question please submit your issue via the Q&A function and our team will help you out. On completion of the feedback survey, BSI will forward presentations and recording of the webinar in due course. And this is a CPD recognised webinar. Please submit your certificate via the feedback survey following the event. So we have two great experts joining us live today who both took part in this latest revision of ISO 15189. First, we'll be hearing from David Ricketts. David currently works as Head of Process Improvement for Health Service Laboratories, which is part of the wider Sonic Healthcare Group. David is also the Managing Director of his own consultancy firm and Chair of the UK Mirror Committee to ISO TC 212, which is responsible for ISO 15189. We'll then be hearing from Ben Courtney, who is Deputy Chair of the UK Mirror Committee and Clinical and Quality Director at Signpost Diagnostics. Prior to this, Ben worked at UCAS as Section Head for Medical Laboratories. Now, I'll hand over to David, who will get us started by talking us through the main clauses of this new version of ISO 15189.
Okay, thank you, Helena. Next slide, please. So, this is talking about ISO 15189, and I think it's very useful just to give some background. ISO 15189 is an international standard written by the International Committee. Therefore, it is written by agreement with everyone, and the important thing is that the standard can be applied across multiple health systems. Therefore, I often get questions, in my country, we need to do this. Then if you have a regulation or a requirement in your country, that applies. 15189 is not a regulatory document and is always, if there is a national or local regulation or requirement, that always has to be taken into account when you're looking at 15189. And this often is a misconstrued idea that 15189 is somehow a legal document. It is not. The international standards are written to support organisations by providing information and guidance. In this case, it's the minimum requirements for quality and competence in medical laboratories. Note it's a minimum requirement. If it's not in the standard, it doesn't mean you can't do it. If you want to go above the standard, we absolutely encourage this. This is actually a minimal requirement as a guidance document. Now, these standards are written for laboratories primarily, but can be used as an assessment document by accreditation bodies, in our case, UCAS. Next slide, please. So, BSI, what role do we have? We have a mirror technical committee to the international committee. In this case, it's ISO Technical Committee 212. I am the current chair of the mirror committee, and I'm also one of the drafting team of the new standard in the international committee. Therefore, this is partially my fault. Next slide, please. So, hot off the press, the FDIS has been out to vote and it has now passed the vote. So the last hurdle for this becoming a new version of the standard has now happened. The vote closed last Friday and we had a lot of editorial comments, but the vote was successful. Any structural changes would have been left to the next version. As we've had many rounds of comments and reviews as part of this writing process, I think we've had something in the region of 8,000 to 9,000 comments we've had to go through. This now has to go to editing and also for translation. And we expect this will be released hopefully by December. There is a lot of edits. The reason we get a lot of edits is a lot of people will now be reading the standard in its final form, and they'll be saying, how can I translate this into my local language? And there may be some clarification in the English we need to put forward to make it easier to translate. So it's not unusual for a lot of edits to happen on the FDIS stage. These will now go to the ISO editing committee, and as soon as they are edited and we get a final check to sense check nothing has been changed, they will release the document. We are hopeful by December this year. There will be a transition period. Normally this is 3 years for accreditation purpose, and the indication I have from ILAC, which is the International Laboratory Accreditations people, they will be looking at a 3-year transition. How this is going to be managed is not a question for BSI, but I'm sure UCAS now will be providing plenty of information on this, and I am working closely with UCAS. ISO 22870 will be withdrawn as a standard, as this is now part of the text of 15189. Next slide, please. So, what's new? The new version of 15189 has been written with the patient at the heart of this document. We are obviously an essential service for medicine as a whole, and as such, we need to make sure that this is fit for purpose for the patient. This means how we think about a quality management system and our audits, for example, these have to be focused really on the patient. So one of the key things we ask in this standard is what's the risk to the patient on us doing something? And we need to audit that. Risk and clinical risk are important concepts. And the importance of understanding the clinical questions asked are recognised as factors to be considered. Service level agreements are essential tools for compliance, and I'll talk more about that. And as I've already stated, point of care is part of the main standard now. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we've done is we've had 2 revisions of our parent standards, which is ISO 9001 in 2015 and ISO 17025 in 2017, which ISO 15189 is a normative reference of. A normative reference is a document which is referenced within the management system, and these documents contain information that must be understood and used to implement this standard. Fortunately for yourselves, you don't actually have to read the 2 parent standards because we've covered that in the text. But what we've had to do now is fit the structure of 15189 into the structure of 9001 and into the structure of 17025, which had its structure changed in 2017 to mirror the structure in the new version of 9001 from 2015. So we now have all 3 standards following the same spine and the same structure. Next slide, please. The order of the standard has been revised, and therefore requirements are now ordered differently to 2012 version. So the standard's got the following order of requirements, and I know Ben will be covering this in more detail. We start off with general, structural and governance, resource, process, and then management systems last. There is a normative annex which is going to support point of care, but truth be told, the point of care information is all within the documents. We've added the annex really just to try and bring it all together and make it easier to read, although the information in the annex is contained within the core of the document. Next slide, please. So, important concepts. There is now no requirement for a quality manual. There's no requirement in 9001. There's no requirement in 17025. This does not mean you cannot have one, but it's just that it's not compulsory. The information needs to be appropriate for the target audience and is no longer prescriptive. Therefore, thought now needs to be given to how this will be evidenced. And this standard is really asking the laboratory to think a lot more about its service and a lot more about how it does things. So there will be a degree of thought. The use of service agreements will cover many of the requirements of this document and therefore will need to be reviewed. Contingency planning as well, given the last few years of pressure, has taken on a greater importance, and certainly we do encourage people to think about contingency planning and do things like tabletop exercises to make sure it's robust. Next slide, please. Okay, service agreements. I want to spend a bit of time on service agreements because these are really important. These are the main tool for the point of care service delivery. So if you're looking to put point of care into your scope, we'd expect a service agreement between, say, A&E for their blood gases and the laboratory, or A&E for blood gases and urines in the laboratory, or for all points of care. We no longer ask people to form a multidisciplinary team, but if you have one that's effective, this can be used to manage these service agreements. What we're saying now is that we understand the difficulty in getting a multidisciplinary team together. So if you can get one, you absolutely can use it. If you can't get one, then we can look at individual agreements for individual services. The service agreement will describe the scope of the point of care covered, the governance and the contractual arrangements. Service agreements can also be used to evidence other things. So for example, it can be used to describe requesting requirements and acceptable mediums on how orders are received, and labelled criteria for different sample types such as complex samples and GP urines. When reviewing the requirements of this document, think whether they can be evidenced by a service agreement, because there is a lot of times where we're asking you to think about your service, how you're going to deliver your service, and also how you're going to evidence this. So always think back to the service agreement as a tool to help you evidence this. Next slide, please. Other considerations, there are requirements which cover personnel, including training, competence, personal development and facilities. There are requirements for equipment, reagents and maintenance. These are all covered. Also, the requirements for pre-examination, examination, post-examination processes are included, and these have all been updated to allow for the fact that technology has moved on. Next slide, please. Okay, there is no longer the term request form. It no longer exists in the standard. The request can be any medium agreed by the lab and the user, and we'd need to look how this is evidence that you have this agreement. This may be in your handbook, this may be in your service agreement, but we absolutely understand that the world has moved on, and quite often bits of paper don't move between individuals. Excuse me. This can be electronic, this may be QR codes, but it's very important, although we no longer need a request form as such, we do need good information on that form for traceability to the patient. So just because we don't need a request form doesn't mean we don't need a good amount of information to help us to process the request. Next slide, please. Accepting or rejecting samples. Now, this standard is incredibly risk-based, so we no longer have any minimum requirement for labelling samples. There are regulations that must be followed, and you should know your regulations because these will be varying across the world, and there must be traceability to the patient. That's all we're asking for. The decision to accept or not accept needs to be risk-based, and the risk of harm to the patient by accepting or not accepting must influence this. So as you're aware, blood transfusion has specific regulations we need to follow. We'd expect those to be followed. But if you have, for example, a urine taken by a patient at home who's written their name on it, put it in the bag with the request form and sent it in, then under the old standard, technically speaking, that did not meet the minimum requirements for labelling. Under the new standard, there is no minimum. Therefore, you can take a risk-based decision that this is very low risk and therefore accept that. And in fact, you may even wish to put in your service agreement with primary care the labelling that you require and the risk in that service agreement. So there's all options there that you can look at, but we no longer are prescriptive about labelling. We just expect it to be traceable. Next slide, please. Okay, this is significant now, validation and verification. Ben is chairing a separate ISO standard on validation and verification, which is going through its early stages of writing. But there is some important concepts. Verification requires the process to evidence that something works in the laboratory's hands. This doesn't mean get a load of data produced by the diagnostic company, have a look at it and say, yes, that's fine. You are not verifying that equipment in your hands. We need to understand that the verification covers this equipment's now been validated, it's now been given to you. How does it work in your hands? Just asking a company to come in and just run all the tests for you, in my opinion, doesn't satisfy the fact that you're verifying it properly. All you're doing is a data review with someone who's incredibly competent and knows the equipment backwards. Verification also needs to consider the clinical question being asked. One of the examples I'll give is that if you have say a tumour marker, and that's being used and the kit insert says it needs to be for monitoring only, yet it's being used for diagnostic reasons, i.e. outside the scope, then you would need to validate it for that scope. And as we say, validation also requires you to consider the clinical question being asked. So now there's a lot more emphasis on what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what's the impact on the patient. If you're using a test outside the intended use of methods, you would need to validate, not verify. And again, that goes across various tests and various markets. There is also a laboratory developed testing standard being written, and that's going through its committee draft stage at the moment. But it's very important that you need to consider the clinical question on verification and validation. Next slide, please. So there is no recommendation anymore on frequency and QC, only that it needs to be run based on stability of the method and the risk of a failed QC to the patient. It should be clinically significant levels if possible, and there are suggestions what alternative QC can be used. One thing you need to consider here, especially if you're procuring, if it is a new method, you will not have the stability and the risk fully established. Therefore, you will need to work closely with the companies. Also, if you're going to tender, if you're tendering and someone's coming in with a new method and they'll say, well, how much QC are you going to run? There needs to be some detailed conversation about how you're going to manage this. Now, this needs to be explained to your procurement department so they don't stop you from talking to the company and having these conversations. So you just need to bear that in mind if you're looking at a new method or you're tendering for equipment that you haven't used before, because you will need at some stage to look at stability and the risk of a failed QC, but you will need to have that conversation before you actually purchase the equipment. Next slide, please. Measurement uncertainty, it's still required. Certainly that's one of the things we had lots of feedback from people that really didn't want measurement uncertainty to be in there, but it absolutely has to be in there. There are options to justify it if MU is not possible or appropriate. It can't be ignored, it has to be evidenced. It's clear that the MU should not be reported but be available on request, and there's lots of conversations happening, I know about this. And don't forget there is a supporting document to help with measurement uncertainty. Next slide, please. Emergency preparation, I've talked about. There needs to be plans for emergency situations. There needs to be training in place. If there is actual emergency situations, which I'm sure we all have quite regularly, these need to be lessons learned, and these lessons need to be shared. There needs to be evidence of mitigation in place. And the last few years have highlighted the importance of this. Now, one of the things you may have a business continuity plan. And this business continuity plan may, for example, be, oh, we've agreed to send the work to site B, should there be an issue. And you may have agreed this 10 years ago. Well, the person you may have agreed it with may well have left, retired, moved jobs, or there may have been a change in the structure of that. So are you sure that your business continuity plans will actually work? Have you revisited your sites and said, actually, if we go down, will you be able to take our work? Are you still willing to take our work? And how would we manage to get samples to you and manage to get results back into our systems or results to our users? Now, this can be a tabletop exercise, but I would strongly suggest that as part of your emergency preparation, you don't just look at your document and think, yep, so-and-so down the road will do our work, but actually so-and-so shut the lab and went to a different laboratory 4 years ago. So it's really important that you do actually do some tabletop planning of this and make sure that your business continuity plans are robust. Because one of the problems you have is that things look great on paper, but unless you test it and unless you try it out, you don't know if it's actually going to work. Next slide, please. Okay, so read the words carefully. The wording of the standard is deliberate and carefully worded. Most of the concerns I've been approached with can actually be answered by rereading the text. Look for shalls, shoulds, and importantly mays, especially if you read the consent sentence. One of the feedback I had is that we had something on consent that was a should. Before that, there was a may statement, and someone then said to me, but we can't do this should because that doesn't apply to us. But if you'd actually read the sentence, we had a may beforehand, which obviously means may not. If it doesn't apply, then the rest of that sentence doesn't apply. There are options to omit information, and the term as appropriate are used, but evidence justifying the actions taken is required because we're asking you to think about your service. Next slide, please. There will be a guidance document written to support the launch, and there is ongoing work between the professional bodies and UCAS to help the transition of this document. So I'll be speaking at numerous meetings coming up. There will be articles in things like the Biomedical Scientist and some of the other magazines that will give you support. And as always, we're always here to try and assist and aid you through this process because this is a big mindset change. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll now pass you back to Helena.
Thanks, David. I'd now like to introduce Ben Courtney, who will be giving us an overview of the management and technical requirements, including point of care testing. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Helena, and thanks, David. Can we move on the slide, please? Next slide, please. Next. Brill. Morning, everybody. A virtual good morning, or whatever time it is where you are. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction, as Helena said, I'm Ben Courtney, I'm Clinical and Quality Director at the moment, but I cast my mind back several years to transition to ISO 15189 within the UK, and transition from CPA standards to ISO 15189. And I suppose that's where I want to start, in the sense that that was a very much UK-centric experience, but there should be no huge surprises in the publication of this document. If you understand ISO 15189 2012, there should be no surprises in the reissue of this 2022/2023 version. One question that you might have is, why are we not using the text of the standard in this particular presentation? And just to clarify that, there are copyright issues, and the fact that the standard isn't yet published, we're not able to do that. So this isn't like a transition for anyone who's UK experience from CPA standards to ISO 15189, where there were significant gaps and differences between that particular standard and the new one. For instance, there were no specific, or there wasn't an assessment focused on measurement uncertainty and verification and validation. Whilst laboratories did that, the requirements weren't necessarily particularly applied or focused on. I think globally we'd be doing that heavily now, focusing on measurement uncertainty, traceability, verification and validation, the big three, as I like to refer to them. This standard, this new publication, is a refinement and a clarification rather than significant new requirements. So ultimately what I'm saying is that the requirements are very similar, but written differently. That said, if any of you on this call have experience of the transition from 17025-2005 to 17025-2017, you'll understand that a gap analysis was essential still in that transition to make sure that you didn't miss anything, but also to make sure that you address the requirements in the right way, in the right place, and understood the organisation of the standard and how that had been moved about. And if we go on to my next slide, please, we will see what I mean by that. Now, this is quite a very simple overview of what has changed in terms of the clauses or the structure of the standard. So very simplistically, in terms of requirements that an organisation, a laboratory has to meet, it's split into section 4 and section 5. Now, I'm going to swap those round right now and say there's the technical requirements currently, section 5 of ISO 15189. Those requirements are now split over section 6, which is resource requirements, and section 7, which are process requirements. And I'll go into these in a little bit more depth to point to what each of those sections actually contains. They then have the management requirements, which actually split over 4 sections. We have the section 4 general requirements, and section 5 structure and governance requirements, section 8 which are management system requirements, but actually some of the process requirements which I mentioned came under technical requirements are also containing some of the management requirements as well. So there's a structural understanding that I think anybody within a laboratory working to ISO 15189, trying to meet requirements of ISO 15189, needs to understand in the first instance, because I suppose what it helps slightly is the slight adaptation away from the very linear approach the organisations sometimes thought ISO 15189 delivered, in the sense that you went through section 4, none of those clauses necessarily spoke to each other, but that's not how the standard should be best applied. It's best if each of the requirements work together to form an effective quality management system and deliver quality and competence in the medical laboratory. Next slide, please. So if I talk about resource requirements, which is a technical requirement, as I said, note the word resource requirements. Now, that's a focus on staff resource, accommodation resource, and equipment resource. And those terms will immediately become familiar with the current version of ISO 15189. So when I say there's no surprises there, that's literally it. I mean, we would expect any organisation applying 15189 expect an accredited, well, a standard that could be accredited to deliver competence and to help demonstrate competence within a medical laboratory. So expect similar competence and ongoing competence requirements, and that includes ensuring externally contracted advisors are evaluated. So there is nothing new there. There is no necessarily additional requirements with regards to how does one demonstrate competence. It's understanding what those requirements are, and if you have a suitable competency assessment program in place for your staff, then that should follow through and be suitable for the new version. Now, the same is true in evaluating your accommodation resource and your equipment resource. You will still find the same requirements regarding suitability of accommodation, monitoring of accommodation, monitoring your equipment installation checks, and so on. So what we'll find very similar is reagent and consumables, equipment, traceability requirements, and as David focused on, the requirement for a really robust service agreement with the users of your service. Now, whether that's on a point of care testing level, as David alluded to, very important, of course, but service agreements in terms of service delivery for any contract, and you can really regard any request for work as a service agreement. So understanding that now is quite key, often referred to in ISO 17025, that's contract review. Same is true for ISO 15189. I think laboratories have to understand that a service agreement agreed between two organisations is something that needs to be delivered on, has to be really clear, and has to be reviewed regularly. Next slide, please. So the other technical requirement section that I referred to was process requirements. And as you might understand, this and might expect, this includes pre-examination, examination, and post-examination procedures. So, and as far as that's concerned, I mean, David alluded to the fact that there's no mention of the word request form. So if you talk about service agreements as we did before, and pre-examination procedures as we're talking about here, I think whilst there's no mention of the word request form, that doesn't mean obviously that you can't use a regular paper and pen request form. It's just acknowledgement of the fact that, as David said, times have moved on. We have to understand how that works, that there are different ways of doing things these days, and the standard has to adapt to be able to recognize that. So in doing this, the process requirements cover the full range of the front-to-end laboratory process. We're talking about control of data, laboratory information management system, and contingency planning. So when I talk about how it brings this in a sensible way, LIMS is now in context rather than set alone at the end of ISO 15189 as it is at the moment in 5.10. It's actually intrinsic to the control of data and management of data and managing the laboratory process from pre-examination through to post-examination. So sample receipt through to sample reporting, result reporting. Interestingly, complaints has been brought in to the technical side of the requirements in this section of the standard process requirements, as has non-conforming work. Now, complaints was a little bit of a one-liner in ISO 15189 2012, and I think that was personally a little bit of a notable absence, really. I think that needed expanding, and it has been, to include processing the complaint, receipt of complaint, and resolution of complaint. So I certainly say that's something that laboratories habitually focus on and make sure is complete from start to finish and make sure resolved. And actually, complaints tend to get resolved by the same mechanism of non-conforming work, not always, but quite often. But specifying the complaints needs to be expanded to include the process, the receipt, and resolution really makes it clear to laboratories that that's what's needed. There needs to be a solid process in place. That's a process that can then be audited, monitored, evaluated, improved, and so on. So really interesting changes there with regards to the process requirements and bringing those formally management requirements, management system requirements into technical process requirements, because as we know, complaints and non-conforming work can quite often be technical related. Next slide, please. Now, so with regards to actually the pre-examination process, as I said, there is little change there. If you have a robust pre-examination process at the moment, you can expect that that will probably conform to the new requirements. I think there is a case for tracking the current requirements of ISO 15189 2012 with the new requirements, and just doing that monitoring between the two. But I think if we look at examination processes, as David mentioned a couple of slides on measurement uncertainty and test assurance. I think we've got both the same message here. I think as far as measurement uncertainty goes, that needed clarity. I think we've got that from the new standard. I think a lot of laboratories will be pleased to see what that clarity looks like. And there's still the requirement for measurement uncertainty calculations on measured quantity values. It's a little bit clearer with qualitative methods about how and when and should you do that. And I think a lot of organisations would be pleased to see that clarity. As far as test assurance goes, when I say test assurance, I'm talking about internal quality control and external quality assurance, otherwise known as proficiency testing. There's clear specification what the requirements are, with very obvious options available, and the different options that are available should something not be available. There is no mandated requirement with regards to frequency of EQA provision, but one has to remember that an organisation must always look to local regulations, local accreditation body requirements with regard to EQA participation and frequency of that. For instance, in the UK, the UCAS publication TPS 47 will ask you to justify the frequency of your participation, because it would expect that you participate in every distribution from that EQA provider where you have that testing in your scope of accreditation. Fair to say post-examination requirements, and when I say that, I'm talking about resulting, reporting, review, amending of reports and so on. That is very similar to the current version. So if an organisation has a currently compliant, robust system in place, you can expect that you'd meet the requirements of the new standards as well. Next slide, please. I think as we move into now the section, if you remember my second slide, which blocked each area of the different requirements and the different sections, and married that up to the current version of ISO 15189. We're now moving on to management requirements. So the first one of these is a general requirements, and there are very clear now requirements, whilst there were before about impartiality, confidentiality, and so on. I think the requirements there were a little bit more indirect. So, for instance, how can I present that for the best? 15189/2012 might say the integrity of the organisation must be protected, and there must be appropriate mechanisms in place to protect impartiality. Now it goes a step further. So labs need to ensure a clear commitment to impartiality and out eliminate threats to impartiality. I think that's a really important message to get across to laboratories, that is fundamental to the competence and the integrity of an organisation, that they demonstrate that they are impartial and they eliminate threats to impartiality. Confidentiality, similarly, I think in the world of GDPR, that needs to be a little bit more well honed. There is a defined responsibility for the management of information and how and when information might be released, for instance, for legal purposes or whatever. And interestingly, there are specific requirements around the patient's well-being, safety and rights, and how the laboratory might protect against those things or put systems in place to make sure they're as protected as far as possible. Next slide, please. Next section would be structural and governance requirements. It's section 5 of the new standard. And within this is literally just reorganizing current requirements. So if we talk about legal entity, laboratory director competence and responsibilities, documenting the lab activities, these are already requirements in ISO 15189/2012. It's just making sure these are mapped in a laboratory and implementing the new version of 15189 in your laboratory is making sure that the new requirements are mapped to the old requirements and where they are in the standard. But ultimately, there's nothing new here. A laboratory would ensure that they're a legally identifiable entity, that the laboratory director has the competence and responsibilities to do what they need to do, that they document laboratory activities, and also you define and structure your and the authorities within your organisation and the quality management system. So that's referring to how your quality system documentation is structured, and the structure and responsibilities of the organisation. So your organisational chart, really. One important feature, though, of structural and governance requirements is something that David focused on, which is real close monitoring of risk management and a commitment to risk management and making sure that risk is minimised. Next slide, please. And finally, we go on to management system requirements. I mean, let's be honest, if a laboratory is accredited to ISO 15189-2012, meeting the requirements of the new version should not be a problem, because the requirements of the management system are the same. There's no additional requirements in terms of fundamental clauses. So the requirement for evaluation and audits are still there, management review and so on. All of those elements are still there. You will have those structures and procedures in place already. It's just, as I said before, mapping those to the new standard and making sure any fine sort of edits in the requirements are adopted. Just to remember, though, once again, a focus on identifying and acting on risks and opportunities for improvement is focused more on. That is heightened. So continual improvement is mentioned in 15189-2012. Identifying risk is mentioned too, but there is a real focus on identifying and acting on those risks and opportunities for improvement. So capturing opportunities for improvement and making sure those are developed and integrated into the management system is important. I think what you'll find is probably an accreditation body may sort of focus on those as new requirements and see how you use opportunities for improvement, integrate them into your management system, and then monitor them. Next slide, please. So this is to do with the Annex A, point of care testing. The simple fact is that ISO 22870 will be withdrawn. So any of your organisations out there who are accredited for point of care testing or looking to get accreditation for point of care testing, previously that required you to get the bolt-on standards of ISO 22870. Point of care testing is effectively treated like any other discipline in ISO 15189. There is a normative annex, which is this Annex A for point of care testing, but to put this into context, the annex consists of 7 sentences. Those 7 sentences are to do around governance of point of care testing, a quality assurance program, which in effect would be covered in the main text, because if you've got a QA program for all your other disciplines, why would you not have it for point of care testing? And then the training program. But again, if you've got a training program for all your other pathology disciplines, you need to have it in place for point of care testing. So the annex really doesn't add an awful lot. Ultimately, you could treat point of care testing as another pathology discipline. And we talk about governance of point of care testing. That would be to do with your point of care testing management groups and multidisciplinary team meetings and so on that cover that governance, the requirement for it, and whether anything needs to be removed from your point of care testing scope. So next slide, please. So in summary, what am I saying about ISO 15189, the new version? It's less prescriptive. Justify your approach to requiring things that or not, and that sort of then leads on to the risk side of things. That's my second point there, that risk and clinical risk are important concepts in the new ISO 15189. I think David has said that virtually word for word, as he said about service agreements are essential tools for compliance. I would say if you're accredited to ISO 15189, this will not be a transition remotely on the scale of the CPA transition. Now, what it will be like, if you have any experience of it, is similar to the 17025-2005 to 17025-2017 transition. It's likely that this will be 3 years, but we'll leave that to ILAC to confirm, and then that'll be rolled out, and a plan for that will be communicated to you by your local accreditation body, which in the UK is UCAS. But almost certainly, though, your first job is to buy the standard when it's available and do a gap analysis between your current management system and what the requirements of the new standard are. And that concludes my presentation. I think we can move on to Q&A. Back to you, Helen. Helena.
Brilliant, thanks. Thanks very much to David and Ben for those really interesting and informative presentations, which I think gave a good overview of the changes you can expect to see in this new version of the standard and how to best approach the transition. So we'll now get started with the Q&A session. If I could just ask David and Ben to put your cameras on, which I can see you've done, and mute yourselves when you're not speaking, that would be great. So we've received some great questions from the audience, both prior to and during this webinar. Please do keep sending them in. We might not be able to answer every question, but we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. So one question that we've received from the audience is, with the emphasis on service agreements in particular, will any model templates be issued that can be adapted to suit the specific requirements of individual laboratories, or any other templates for key documents such as emergency planning?
I'll pick this one up. As BSI, we cannot be prescriptive, but one thing I am doing is I'm going to be talking to the professional bodies and UCAS to see if the professional bodies wish to suggest something for this. But certainly, as a standard writing organisation, we cannot be prescriptive on how the evidence is presented. But as I say, that is a question I will put to the professional bodies, because I think they'll be in a good place to help with this.
Okay, thank you, David. Another question we've received is there anything we need to be concerned about regarding how the new version of ISO 15189 fits with the IVDR?
As I stated before, IVDR is a regulation, therefore it's stumped standard every time. So IVDR will apply. The standard is a guidance document that fits around regulation.
Okay, great. So another question we received prior to the webinar was, how does this standard differ from ISO 17025 on testing and calibration laboratories?
Okay, 15189 is designed for the medical laboratories. 17025 is designed for testing laboratories. There are two different audiences, and certainly when we look to write the standards, we make sure that there is no contradiction between different versions of the standard. And that's certainly something we've looked at. And Ben, I don't know if you want to mention the standard you're writing and the process we're following.
Well, more just to go to the point is how it's different from 17025. As David says, 17025 is a standard written for testing laboratories and calibration laboratories actually as well. The similarity is the structure ultimately, but the content is, if you compare ISO 15189 2012 and 17025 2017, you see the differences there, right? Those are the differences right there. So ultimately, the standards are written for two different organisations. So I think that's the best that we can say to that question.
Great, thank you. Another question we've received is, how do we get more insight about the risk and clinical risk concept as it pertains to ISO 15189?
We have a series of documents. So we refer to, in a lot of our standards, helpful documents that are written by ISO. And this time, if you read ISO 22367, which is risk in medical laboratories, that will have lots of information for you. We don't put them all in the same standard because basically it becomes unmanageable. So we have to write separate standards. But if you're interested in risk and clinical risk, 22367 covers that in great detail for you.
I think that's right. I think 22367 is the standard to go to. I think the other thing we have to bear in mind is, as I mentioned at the top of my presentation, is there's only so much of this standard that we can display and talk about. I think when the standard's published, I think what we'll get is a lot of professional bodies and local accreditation bodies in the UK, that would be UCAS, presenting on how 15189, the new version, could be best applied. And I think I would say to anybody on the call, look out for that towards, well, post-publication, which might be in the new year, but look out for any LinkedIn adverts related to that, I would guess.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, please do keep your questions coming through. So another one we've received is, does this standard enable us to move towards the situation where clinicians ask clinical questions rather than requesting tests? The laboratory decides what tests are done based on the clinical information provided and then reports to clinicians on possibilities rather than specific test results.
This standard is clinically based. This standard is patient focused. What this standard is not is prescriptive on what your local practice is, but certainly we do encourage greater clinical input and more of a risk-based approach to the patient. What we can't do is say what you do locally, but again, I refer back to the fact that we are meeting with the professional bodies, and then we would look to them for guidance there.
Thanks, David. Another question refers to algorithmic tests, where multiple tests are performed and an algorithm decides on the result. Can the standard help how these might be quality managed, as the combined measurement uncertainties will be large and the diagnostic sensitivities and specificities may be significantly affected by small changes in the algorithm?
So in terms of measurement uncertainty, we now have a parent document, 20914, and that goes through lots and lots of scenarios and guidance. But again, you know, we have tried to clarify measurement uncertainty, and we now have guidance documents to support that.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, it's 15189 provides a framework for a good quality management system, and it demonstrates the requirements that you have to meet as an organisation. Why do we have it there? We have it there for a good, so we have the framework for a good quality management system, and a local accreditation body can accredit to it. That's an important concept to demonstrate, because what does an accreditation body want to see? It wants to see a competent organisation that understands how their testing works, understands how algorithmic testing might work, and the effect that might have on measurement uncertainty. The only thing that we can, because there is no rule, there is no prescription that you can say. All we can say is to reinforce the concepts that David's mentioned, and I have too, which is that this is all about justifying your approach and the risk associated with something, and understanding the effects that measurement uncertainty have on a test result. So there is no right and wrong way to do things. It's understanding how 15189 can work for you. It has been adapted to allow to make allowances for these things and for laboratories to justify their approach.
Great, that's really interesting. So another question we've received is, service agreements and emergency planning are important. Is there guidance on how far agreements need to go when referring tests to another lab as contingency in terms of measurement uncertainty or comparability, etc.?
So again, we are not prescriptive. There does have to be that question about what value does that add. Certainly measurement uncertainty is measurement uncertainty that's set by the laboratory. You can't have lots of requesters saying, oh, can I check your measurement uncertainty to make sure it applies to me, because that's not the point. And the same is that the there has to be a value statement when you are looking at you're sending to another laboratory. There has to be in clinical interpretation. Asking someone just to review all their reference ranges and their MU actually adds no value. You know what the reference ranges are, you know the MU, it will be on the report, then that will be for the local clinician to interpret. Sorry, the MU won't be on the report. And we do say MU is there should you request, but for example, if a reference laboratory wants to see all 3,000 MU for where it's referring to, I'm not quite sure what value that brings and how that improves quality, because the MU is the MU. And certainly there's always a responsibility in anyone reporting a result where the result's going to be significantly impacted in interpretation by MU to make sure that that conversation is had. Ben, if you've got a thought on that.
No, I think you covered it David. I think I've probably lost sight of the original question now. But what I would say, and I'm going to say, is that when it comes to referring to other laboratories, I suppose the fundamental concept is that you would have to have acceptance criteria for the laboratories that you refer to. Now, if those laboratories are accredited for the testing that you're looking to refer, and you've done due diligence ahead of that in terms of reviewing the MU to make sure that's suitable for your needs and your demographic and so on, then the rest should look after itself. Ultimately, what do we say again? Evaluate the risk associated with something. The risk would be low if a laboratory is accredited for a particular scope of testing.
Yeah, and again, the whole point of accreditation is MU and reference ranges are assessed as that. So I would look, if I'm referring to somewhere, are they accredited? Yes, that's acceptable. Otherwise, there's no point in accreditation.
Okay. Okay, so I think we've probably got the time for one more question if we answer it quite quickly. So do you expect ISO 15189 would be acceptable as a quality management system to support IVDR CE marking if the medical laboratory is considered to be a legal manufacturer of tests, or if a laboratory is not considered to be a healthcare institution?
15189, as I stated before, is not a regulatory document. It's a guidance document for quality and competence. Regulation is something different. So you may wish to put it forward as evidence, but it is not a document designed to comply with regulation. It's a document that's for quality and competence, and regulatory aspects always have to be considered ahead of a non-regulatory standard like 15189.
Okay, brilliant. So we're nearing the end of the webinar, so I'm going to wrap up the Q&A session there, but thank you to everyone for your questions. I'd like to say a massive thank you to David and Ben for your presentations today. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. Goodbye everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks everyone.